Section 1. Whisper of a vanished line. You sit in the quiet of evening when the last trace of daylight has already surrendered to a horizon the color of faded vellum. The house is still, the world outside a hush of crickets and wind. It is in this silence that the most dangerous stories return, those that were never meant to be told in daylight, those that linger like smoke long after the fire has been extinguished. Tonight, we are not opening a history book. We are opening a gap, an absence in the record so carefully constructed that its silence has lasted for over 1,000 years. And yet, silence speaks. If you lean close enough, you can almost hear it. A whisper of a name, a dynasty that reigned and then was erased. A bloodline that some claim could change everything we think we know about the origins of power, of kingship, even of Christianity itself. They were called the Merovingians, the long-haired kings, a dynasty that ruled the Franks from the 5th to the 8th century. At first glance, their story seems ordinary enough. The tale of barbarian rulers consolidating territory in the wake of Rome's collapse. But the more you trace their legacy, the more peculiar details surface. Strange symbols carved into tombs, legends of miraculous visions, and a violent end that came not with open war, but with a subtle, almost surgical erasure. And always, beneath these details, a question breathes. Why were the Merovingians made to disappear so completely? The official chronicles tell us that their line ended when the Carolingians seized power, backed by papal authority. The story is neat, clean, and convenient. The Merovingians were weak, decadent, unfit to rule. Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, simply stepped in with the blessing of the church, and history marched on. But history is rarely that simple. Behind every royal deposition, behind every papal decree, there is another layer, hidden motives, unspoken fears. And in the case of the Merovingians, whispers persist that what was erased was not merely a dynasty, but a secret tied not to politics, but to blood. Imagine for a moment a candlelit scriptorium in the early Middle Ages. Monks bending over parchment, copying line after line with patient hands. One stroke too many, one word omitted, and a name disappears. Not because it was never there, but because someone decided it should no longer be remembered. That is how power works, not only by what it builds, but by what it erases. And yet, erasure is never perfect. Fragments remain, a carved bee in a chapel mosaic, a fleur-de-lis etched deeper than it should be above a church door, a lineage hinted at in a dusty genealogy no one was supposed to read. These fragments form the outline of something too dangerous to state directly. The whispers say the Merovingians were not merely kings. They were custodians of something older, something sacred. Their authority was not based on conquest alone, but on a bloodline that some claim reached back, not only to the earliest Christian traditions, but perhaps to Christ himself. It is here, at the intersection of history and legend, that the mystery sharpens. Was the Holy Grail truly a chalice, a cup carried from the Last Supper? Or was it something far more unsettling? Sangreal, royal blood, a lineage preserved in silence, protected across centuries. This interpretation is not new. It has been whispered in monasteries, encoded in manuscripts, and hinted at in esoteric societies. The Grail as womb, as vessel, as bloodline. The Grail not as an object to be found, but as a family to be protected or suppressed. And if this interpretation is true, the Merovingians would not merely be one dynasty among many. They would be something else entirely, a bridge between the sacred and the secular. Kings not just by politics, but by divine inheritance. Such an idea is dangerous. If holiness can be inherited by blood, then the authority of the Church is undermined. If sanctity is not confined to altar and sacrament, but runs through the veins of living rulers, then who truly holds power? Priests or kings? Rome or Gaul? Perhaps this is why Dagobert II, the last Merovingian king of real consequence, met his end in a lonely forest in 679, pierced by an assassin's spear. Officially, his death was political, a matter of dynastic rivalry. But unofficially, legend insists he was removed because he threatened to reclaim not only a throne, but a truth too dangerous for the Church to tolerate. His son, Sigisbert IV, vanishes into the mist of history. Some chronicles claim he died young, extinguished before he could carry the line forward. Others suggest he survived, spirited away to the south of France, where his descendants merged quietly into local nobility. A bloodline hidden, not lost. And here is where our story begins, not with certainty, but with silence. Not with proof, but with patterns. As you settle deeper into the quiet of this evening, think of all the times history has left gaps. A tomb without bones, a manuscript with missing pages, a name cut from a genealogy. These are not accidents. They are choices. Choices that point to something worth hiding. The Merovingians may have been erased from official memory, but their shadow lingers in symbols, in architecture, in folklore. And every time you see that shadow, you are faced with the same question. Was this dynasty destroyed because it was weak? Or because it was too powerful in a way the world was not ready to admit? Tonight, we follow that shadow. From the tombs of forgotten kings to the frescoes of Mary Magdalene. From the vaults of the Templars to the sealed shelves of the Vatican. From the Cathar fires of Languedoc to the coded rituals of Freemasons. Even across oceans to Rosslyn Chapel and Oak Island. The trail is long, winding, and filled with symbols. But all of it begins here, with the whisper of a vanished line. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a bee, small and golden, carved into stone more than 1,000 years ago. To most, it is nothing. Decoration. But to those who knew, it was a message, a code, a reminder that some truths cannot be burned, only buried. And buried truths have a way of waiting. The Merovingians are waiting still. Section 2. Kings with hair of fire. Step closer into the past, into the candlelit world of the 6th and 7th centuries, where kings were not crowned in the way we imagine today. There were no velvet thrones polished with ceremony, no long parades lined with banners. There was instead something stranger, older, and far more mystical. The Merovingians were called the Rex Crinitus, the long-haired kings. Their power was said to reside not in the steel of their swords or the boundaries of their lands, but in their hair. To cut it was to strip them of their right to rule. To touch it without permission was an offense bordering on sacrilege. Their locks were not mere adornments. They were seen as vessels of divine essence, threads binding them to the unseen. Pause and imagine it. A royal court where strength was measured not by polished armor, but by the cascade of unshorn hair. Golden, auburn, sometimes black as ink, always worn long and untamed, as if to declare, we are not bound by earthly order. We are touched by something eternal. The chronicles whisper that when a Merovingian king rode into battle, his hair streamed behind him like a banner of fire. When he stood before his people, his hair caught the light as though the sun itself had chosen him. This is not the language of politics. It is the language of myth. And myth, as history often shows us, is a dangerous foundation for power. The origins of this hair-bound sanctity are elusive. Some say it was inherited from pagan rites of the early Franks, who believed that the life force of a man dwelled in his uncut hair. Others claim it was a conscious echo of the Nazirite vow in Hebrew scripture. Think of Samson, whose strength vanished when Delilah's shears touched his head. Could the Merovingians have modeled themselves as living Samsons, kings consecrated by their refusal to sever what the divine had given? But perhaps the most haunting explanation lies in the legends surrounding their founder, Merovingian. His birth, the stories say, was not ordinary. His mother, the wife of King Clodio, conceived him after a strange encounter in the sea. Some versions whisper that she was visited by a creature both man and beast, something half human, half aquatic. The child she bore, Merovingian, was marked, not of this world. Was this myth a political invention, a way to elevate a dynasty above mere mortals? Or was it, as some have dared to suggest, a veiled attempt to preserve the memory of a bloodline considered too sacred to be named outright? Whatever its source, the idea took root. The Merovingians were no ordinary rulers. They were chosen, and so their hair became their crown. It was said to throb with vitality, to glow faintly in lamplight, to be the seat of visions. Some accounts claim that Merovingian rulers experienced prophetic dreams, that they could heal the sick with a touch, that they bore within them the charisma of saints. Even their enemies seemed compelled to acknowledge this aura. Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century, noted the odd reverence surrounding these kings, a reverence not easily explained by their politics. Their reigns were turbulent, their territories fractured, yet their mystique endured. Something about them lingered, a charisma that resisted conquest. But charisma is fragile. It cannot be quantified, only believed. And belief, once threatened, must either be fortified or destroyed. Consider what it meant for a dynasty to root its legitimacy not in papal blessing, not in conquest, but in symbols. Hair, bees, stars, lilies. These were not just decorations. They were codes, a language of power written not in decrees, but in myth. And that made them vulnerable. For symbols can be reinterpreted, myths can be rewritten. A dynasty that lives by mystery can also die by erasure. And erasure, as we will see, came swiftly. Before we step into that silence, linger for a moment with the image of a Merovingian king seated on a simple wooden throne. His robes are unadorned, but his hair, long, gleaming, falls around his shoulders like a mantle of fire. At his feet, warriors bow not to his weapons, but to the aura he carries. His rule is not political theater, it is sacrament. Now ask yourself, what happens when such a king threatens to outshine the authority of Rome? What happens when sanctity is no longer confined to the church, but embodied in the flesh of a ruler, in the strands of his hair, in the blood flowing through his veins? That is the paradox of the Merovingians. They were kings, but more than kings. They were symbols, but more than symbols. And because of that, they had to vanish. The scissors of history were sharpened, the hair of fire would be cut. And yet, like all sacred flames, it would not go out so easily. Section 3. Symbols carved in stone. If a dynasty can be erased from the page, how does it survive? Not through chronicles or decrees, for those can be burned, redacted, rewritten. What endures is something subtler, symbols, silent, resilient, encoded into stone and cloth, hiding in plain sight. For the Merovingians, The world of symbols was not ornament. It was scripture. Each emblem was chosen not for beauty, but for meaning, as though every stitch and carving were a fragment of an unspoken gospel. The most haunting of these is also the smallest, the bee. To us, it is a humble creature, a metaphor for work and order. But for the Merovingians, the bee represented something eternal, immortality, resurrection, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Childeric I, the father of Clovis, they found not only weapons and jewels, but hundreds of tiny golden bees, crafted with exquisite care, arranged around his body like a constellation. Pause on that image. A king surrounded by golden insects, as if guarded by an army too delicate to be destroyed. They were not random trinkets. They were a declaration. This was no ordinary ruler. This was a king marked by eternal rule, a being bound to something sacred. In ancient symbology, bees often stood for the soul. The Egyptians believed they carried messages between worlds. In Greece, the priestesses of Delphi were called Melissae, bees who spoke the words of the gods. That the Merovingians chose this creature as their emblem tells us what they thought of themselves. They were not mere rulers of land. They were intermediaries, monarchs consecrated to eternity. And yet, the bee vanished. When the Carolingians replaced the Merovingians, the bees disappeared from crowns, banners, and robes. For centuries, they lay dormant, forgotten, or perhaps intentionally suppressed. Only in 1804 did they re-emerge, when Napoleon Bonaparte, at his coronation, embroidered golden bees onto his imperial robes. Was this a coincidence? Or did Napoleon knowingly reach back to a forgotten dynasty, claiming its sacred legitimacy for himself? Historians still debate, but the symbols spoke louder than words. The bee had returned. The second emblem, equally famous, is the fleur-de-lis. 3 petals elegantly flared, a symbol we now associate almost exclusively with French monarchy. Its origins, however, are murkier. Some claim it represents an iris, others a lotus. But among esoteric historians, another reading lingers. The fleur-de-lis, with its threefold shape, could represent not a flower, but a family: father, mother, child. A bloodline disguised as a blossom. Look closely at certain medieval depictions, and you'll notice the fleur-de-lis drawn with curves that echo the female form. Some even suggest it was an homage to Mary Magdalene, to the vessel, the womb, the Grail, not as object, but as origin. In this view, the fleur-de-lis is not merely a royal insignia. It is a cipher, hiding in plain sight, telling those who can read it that the Merovingians claim descent from something far more profound than mere kings. And then there are the stars, strange, 7-pointed symbols etched into coins and seals. To later centuries, the heptagram was mistaken for a sign of darkness, but to the Merovingians, it was a sign of perfection. 7, the union of heaven and earth, spirit and body, eternal and temporal. By carrying this emblem, they were declaring, "We rule not just this world, but the meeting point between worlds." Walk through certain abbeys of Merovingian origin, and you can still find these patterns. Spirals tiled into floors, pillars placed with mathematical precision, chapels dedicated to Magdalene centuries before the church formally elevated her status. And in the corners of mosaics and frescoes, sometimes almost too small to notice, the bee hovers again. Quiet, persistent, a reminder of what lingers when memory fades. Modern scholars may dismiss such readings as coincidence. Bees are common symbols. Flowers, after all, are universal. But pause for a moment. Why do these motifs recur with such consistency across tombs, seals, banners, and coins? Why do they vanish with the fall of one dynasty, only to resurface centuries later in moments of claimed legitimacy? Symbols endure where words cannot. They bypass censors, outlast persecutions, survive fires. You can burn a scroll, but you cannot stop a mason from carving a tiny bee into the corner of a chapel arch. You can rewrite a chronicle, but you cannot erase the fleur-de-lis stitched into the robes of generations. Perhaps this was the Merovingians' greatest act of defiance. They did not write their story in ink, but in symbol. They let their code be scattered across architecture, heraldry, and art, knowing that one day, someone might notice. Someone like you. Now, consider this unsettling thought. If the Merovingians intended their symbols to speak across time, what are they saying to us now? Are they simply echoes of forgotten kings? Or are they invitations, a language waiting to be deciphered? The bee, the fleur-de-lis, the seven-pointed star. Three emblems of a dynasty that officially no longer exists, yet refuses to die. Follow them, and they form a map, a trail carved not into parchment, but into the very stones of Europe. A trail that leads not to treasure, but to blood. And it is blood that turns this story from legend into threat. For if blood carries sanctity, then power itself shifts, and the institutions that rely on controlling sanctity cannot allow that. So the scissors of history cut again. Symbols erased, kings dethroned, records burned. But erasure is never perfect. The bee still flies, the fleur-de-lis still blooms, the star still glimmers. And with them, the shadow of a question that refuses to fade. What truth were they hiding? Soon, we will step into that silence. The moment the Merovingians were overthrown. Not by armies thundering on battlefields, but by whispers in chambers. By a church ready to rewrite the story of kingship itself. But before we arrive there, hold in your mind the image of those golden bees slumbering in Childeric's tomb. They are not decoration. They are guardians of a secret that would not burn. And secrets, as history proves, always find a way to outlive their destroyers. Section 4. The Whispered Overthrow. History often tells of kings brought down by thunder, armies clashing in open fields, banners torn in the smoke of war, dynasties toppled in fire and blood. But the fall of the Merovingians was not thunder. It was a whisper, a quiet, deliberate undoing, like a candle snuffed by unseen fingers. The name at the center of this whisper is Dagobert II. He reigned in the late 7th century, a time when the Merovingian mystique had already begun to trouble powerful neighbors. According to legend, Dagobert was different from his predecessors. He was intelligent, ambitious, perhaps even dangerous to those who wanted kings pliable and predictable. Official chronicles mark his reign as unremarkable, brief, troubled, cut short. But unofficially, the stories surrounding his death burn with suspicion. In 679, while hunting in the forest of Wavre, Dagobert was struck down by an assassin's spear. The weapon was wielded not by a rival noble, but by someone far more unsettling. An agent working, it is said, with the quiet approval of the church. Pause for a moment. This was no battlefield casualty, no palace coups shouted from the rooftops. It was a killing in shadows, an elimination carried out with precision. A king ended in silence, his reign erased almost before it had begun. Why? The official answer is simple: politics. Dagobert had enemies, and in the brutal calculus of medieval power, his death secured stability. But beneath that explanation, another question lingers. Was Dagobert murdered because he was weak or because he was too strong? Consider what we have already seen. The Merovingians were not just rulers, they were symbols. Their authority flowed not from papal blessing, but from the aura of sanctity, from their symbols, from whispers of an inheritance older than Rome itself. To allow such a dynasty to flourish was to risk a rival theology. The idea that holiness might run in veins, not in sacraments. That kings themselves could embody the sacred without the mediation of the church. And so, as the story goes, Dagobert was removed, not with a public trial or open condemnation, but with a spear in the forest, a quiet, surgical cut, followed by the slow cauterization of memory. What of his family? His son, Sigisbert IV, should have been heir. But here their records dissolve into mist. Some say he died young, extinguished before he could claim his inheritance. Others insist he was spirited away to the south of France, to the rugged lands of Septimania, where sympathetic nobles sheltered him. And if that second story is true, then the bloodline did not end. It simply went underground. This is the first great erasure in our mystery. The official extinction of a dynasty that may never have truly died. But history abhors a vacuum, and power rushed to fill the void. The Carolingians stepped forward. Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, emerged as the new ruler. But Pepin was not Merovingian. His legitimacy rested not in hair, not in sacred blood, but in papal blessing. To secure his crown, he made a bargain with Rome. Support me, and I will strengthen the church's hand. It was a brilliant, devastating arrangement. In one stroke, the church secured influence over kingship itself, while the Carolingians secured legitimacy. A new order was born, one that placed sanctity firmly in the hands of the papacy, not in the blood of a dynasty. And what of the Merovingians? Their memory was systematically reduced. Chroniclers painted them as weak, decadent, unfit to rule. Their mystique, the bees, the hair, the symbols, was dismissed as superstition. They became footnotes, shadows in the margins of medieval history. But here's the strange thing. Shadows linger. Even in their erasure, fragments of the Merovingians survived. Folk tales in southern France. Symbols carved into churches. Coins bearing sigils that no one quite explained. It is as if the dynasty itself refused to vanish, like a melody hummed softly even after the music has stopped. And this raises the unsettling possibility. If the Carolingians and the church went to such lengths to erase the Merovingians, what exactly were they erasing? Was it merely a weak dynasty? Or was it something more dangerous, an idea, a bloodline, a claim that could undermine the entire edifice of papal power? Consider again the silence that follows Dagobert's death. No monumental tomb, no detailed chronicle, no elaborate hagiography, as was common for kings of the era. Just absence, an absence too perfect, too neat. Sometimes what is missing tells the loudest story. The Merovingians did not fall in battle. They did not lose their kingdom in a storm of swords. They were whispered out of history, erased with ink and silence. And yet their shadow lingers, in bees, in fleur-de-lis, in symbols carved where no censor could reach. Perhaps that is why, even centuries later, Napoleon turned not to the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbons, but to the bees of the Merovingians. Perhaps he understood what others had tried to forget, that symbols outlast kings and whispers outlast silence. The question now is not simply why Dagobert died, but what survived his death. Did Sigisbert live? Did the bloodline continue? And if so, who guarded it across the centuries? Our journey turns now to those guardians, orders sworn not to rule, but to keep secrets. Orders who dug beneath temples, carried relics across continents, and encoded mysteries into stone. The most famous of them all, the Knights Templar. Section 5. Custodians of Silence. When a dynasty disappears, its shadow must fall somewhere. Bloodlines do not dissolve overnight. They weave themselves into new families, retreat into silence, and survive through the loyalty of those who guard them. If the Merovingians truly carried something sacred, then someone, somewhere, had to protect it. And history whispers that such guardians existed, quiet orders, cloaked in ritual and secrecy, whose mission was not conquest, but concealment. The name that echoes most loudly is the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century, they began as humble protectors of pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. But almost immediately, their mission expanded. They built fortresses, amassed wealth, and, most suspiciously, spent nearly a decade excavating beneath the Temple Mount. Officially, they were repairing their quarters. Unofficially, they were searching. What were they looking for in the ruins of Solomon's temple? Gold, relics, scrolls. Legends insist they uncovered something far more dangerous. Documents, perhaps even genealogies, that pointed to the survival of a bloodline. Records that said Jesus was not only a teacher, but a father. That Mary Magdalene was not only a disciple, but a mother. And that their descendants, woven into the line of Dagobert and Sigisbert, were alive, scattered across the hills of southern France. Imagine the weight of such knowledge. Not treasure in the ordinary sense, but a weapon capable of overturning the authority of the Church itself. If Christ's bloodline endured, then legitimacy did not flow from Rome. It flowed through veins, through families, through flesh. It is here that the legend of the Templar treasure takes root. When King Philip IV of France ordered their arrest in 1307, he expected to seize unimaginable wealth. His men stormed the Paris temple, pried open vaults, and found nothing. No gold, no relics, no scrolls. Empty chambers, silent as tombs. So where did the treasure go? Some believe it had already been smuggled away, loaded onto ships at La Rochelle, bound for Scotland or beyond. Others suggest it was never material to begin with, but knowledge, carried in coded parchments, concealed in plain sight, entrusted to allies. Whatever it was, the absence was deafening. From that absence grew centuries of speculation. Rennes-le-Château, Gisors, Blanchefort, Rosslyn Chapel, each place layered with symbols, each one linked by geometry and rumor, as though somehow. And behind these whispers, another name surfaces. The Priory of Sion, allegedly older than the Templars, described as the true custodians of the bloodline. According to controversial documents deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in the 1960s, the so-called dossiers secrets, the priory traced its mission back to the survival of Sigisbert IV. Their purpose, to guard his descendants, to encode their existence in art and architecture, and to wait until the world was ready. The dossiers are riddled with inconsistencies, and many scholars dismiss them as forgeries. But even if forged, why do the details ring so strangely true? Genealogies that overlap with obscure noble families, place names that line up with Cathar strongholds, symbols, bees, fleur-de-lis, stars, that recur across centuries without explanation. Think of it this way. Whether authentic or not, the very persistence of the priory myth tells us something. A story does not endure this long unless it serves a need. Perhaps the priory itself is less important than what it represents. The idea that someone, somewhere, has always been watching over this bloodline. And if you step back, you begin to see a pattern. Orders rise, fall, are suppressed, yet always a whisper continues. The Merovingians vanish. The Templars are burned. The Cathars are massacred. The priory is dismissed as fabrication. But the symbols remain, waiting for someone to notice. Picture it. A knight in white mantle with a red cross, kneeling not before gold, but before a scroll written in a hand older than his own church. A monk in a French abbey, painting a tiny bee in the margin of a manuscript, smiling faintly because he knows no censor will think to erase it. A mason chiseling a fleur-de-lis deeper into stone, careful to curve it just enough to suggest a womb, a vessel, a grail. These are not accidents. These are acts of preservation. And here is the unsettling thought. What if the greatest treasure of the Templars, the most guarded secret of the priory, was not to be found, but to be kept unfound? A secret so destabilizing that its power lay in silence. If revealed too soon, it could fracture kingdoms. If revealed too late, it could vanish forever. But if held in shadows, preserved in whispers, it could survive. So we must ask, who benefits from such survival? Was it to preserve the sanctity of a family line? Or to hold leverage over the church and kings alike? Or perhaps both? The guardians, whether Templar, priory, or unnamed, did not act for themselves alone. They acted for something larger. And that something was blood. But not all guardians wore armor. Some wore simple robes, lived in villages, and lit candles before images the church considered dangerous. Some walked barefoot through mountain paths, carrying nothing but memory. We know them by another name, the Cathars. And to understand why the church unleashed fire against them, we must descend into the 13th century, into a crusade not against pagans or Muslims, but against Christians themselves. A crusade where the target was not land, but memory, the memory of blood. Section 6. Magdalene at the shore. Follow the trail now away from battlefields and secret archives, down to the edge of the Mediterranean, where salt air mingles with lavender, and the sea carries stories older than the cathedrals that overlook it. Along this coast, in a small village called Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, whispers have endured for centuries. Whispers of a boat without sails, without oars, without crew, drifting ashore under a sky heavy with fate. Inside, tradition says, were 3 women: Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, and Mary Jacobi. To the Church's official canon, these names are familiar but peripheral, women mentioned briefly at the margins of the Gospels. But here, in Provence, they are central. They are founders, bearers of flame, vessels of memory. Pause and imagine it. The waves parting, the boats scraping against the stones, the women stepping onto the shore, cloaked not in wealth, but in silence. They carry no treasure, and yet they bring something more enduring than gold. The earliest breath of Christianity in Europe. The villagers still honor this story each year with a festival unlike any other. Candles float across the water. Drums and chants rise into the night. The Romany people dance in devotion to Saint Sarah, the so-called Black Madonna, said to have arrived with the 3 Marys. Catholic rites blend with something older, almost pagan, as if the land itself refuses to forget what Rome tried to erase. And at the heart of it all is Magdalene. In the Gospels, she is present at the crucifixion. She is the first witness of the resurrection. And then, nothing. Silence. No mention of her travels, no record of her death. A woman central to the greatest event in Christian history disappears from the narrative as though swallowed by air. But in southern France, her story does not end. It begins. For centuries, pilgrims have come to this coastline not only to honor Christ, but to honor Magdalene herself. In the nearby town of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, a massive basilica houses relics said to be hers. A skull encased in gold, strands of red hair still clinging to bone. Monks claim to have discovered them in the 13th century, long before modern theories of sacred bloodlines began to circulate. DNA tests have never been allowed, but the Church has authenticated the relics. And if you stand in that crypt, surrounded by the hush of stone and centuries, you feel the tension of something unspoken, something too fragile for doctrine. Above the town lies La Sainte-Baume, a cave high in the Provençal mountains. Tradition claims Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life here in contemplative seclusion. Her tears, they say, hollowed the cave walls. Her prayers sanctified the air. Even now, pilgrims walk barefoot up the forest path, whispering her name as though each step brings them closer to a truth no cathedral could contain. But why here? Why France? Why did such legends arise and endure in this region, of all places? One answer lies in art. Frescoes from as early as the 6th century, long before the Church formally elevated Magdalene's status, depict her not as a penitent prostitute, as later doctrine would insist, but as a regal figure. She is robed in blue, sometimes crowned, sometimes holding a vessel, often standing beside a child. What do we make of these images? Coincidence, creative imagination, or memory? Some genealogies preserved by noble families in southern France claim descent not from kings or emperors, but from her. Not from Peter, Paul, or Rome, but from Magdalene herself. And here the whispers sharpen. Was she not only a witness, but a mother? Did she arrive in Gaul not alone, but carrying a child, the child of Jesus? The suggestion is explosive. To the faithful, it either deepens devotion or ignites outrage. To historians, it seems unfounded, for there is no written record. But the absence itself feels strange. Why no mention of her fate by the early church fathers, men who cataloged even the smallest details of saints and martyrs? Why the sudden silence? Perhaps because her story had shifted from scripture to secrecy, from gospel to blood. For centuries, the Church worked to reshape her image. By the Middle Ages, Magdalene was rebranded as a repentant sinner, a prostitute redeemed by Christ. A narrative with no basis in the Gospels, yet one that diminished her authority, stripped her of her role as possible partner, matriarch, or vessel of lineage. And yet, even under this weight, she endured. She became the patroness of perfume makers, of contemplatives, of the misunderstood. Her image shifted, but she never vanished. The people of Provence never forgot. They told stories grandmother to granddaughter, of a red-haired woman with a gentle voice, of a boy with her eyes. Not written records, but oral memory. Memory that refuses to die. And so we arrive at the heart of the bloodline theory. That Magdalene brought not only the message of resurrection, but the legacy of flesh. That she was not just the first witness, but the first mother. That the Grail was not a cup, but a womb. Whether you believe it or not, the symbols persist. The basilicas dedicated to her centuries too early. The relics enshrined in golden reliquaries. The caves that pilgrims still climb. The paintings that show her not as a penitent, but as a queen. Perhaps the question is not whether Magdalene bore a child, but why so many have believed she did. why such a story refuses to vanish, why it clings to this coastline like salt on the wind. Because in that belief, the possibility of a bloodline emerges, and with it, a reason why dynasties had to vanish, why archives had to be locked, why whispers still rise in the night. The Church may have sought to silence Magdalene, but silence has never been perfect. Her voice lingers in stone, in ritual, in festival. And if her voice lingers, then so too might her blood. Which brings us back to the Guardians. If Magdalene was the vessel, if her child survived, who kept the legacy alive? Who sheltered the bloodline when kings fell and inquisitors burned? The answer, unsettlingly, leads us not only to abbeys and caves, but to a priest in a quiet village who stumbled onto something the world was never meant to see. A priest named Béranger Saunière, and the village, Rennes-le-Château, Section 7. Rennes-le-Château and the priest's fortune. High in the rolling hills of southern France lies a village so small you could miss it if you blinked. Rennes-le-Château, a cluster of stone houses, narrow lanes, and a modest church dedicated to Mary Magdalene. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a sleepy hamlet perched on a ridge above the Aude Valley. But appearances deceive. For more than a century, Rennes-le-Château has stood at the center of one of history's strangest mysteries. A story that binds bloodlines, treasure, and forbidden knowledge into a single knot. The story begins in the late 19th century with a parish priest named Béranger Saunière. By all accounts, he was ordinary. A man of modest means, overseeing a poor village whose church was in disrepair. And yet, within a few years, Saunière transformed himself into something else entirely. He renovated the church with lavish decoration, built a grand villa and a tower library, and entertained distinguished guests from across Europe. His sudden wealth was astonishing, impossible to explain by parish tithes alone. Where did the money come from? Theories abound. Some say he discovered a cache of treasure hidden centuries before. Perhaps Templar gold, perhaps Cathar relics. Others believe it was something far more dangerous. Parchments, genealogies, or encoded manuscripts proving the survival of the Merovingian bloodline. Whatever it was, Saunière found something while renovating the old church of St. Mary Magdalene, and here the symbols return. Step inside the church, and you are confronted by details that defy easy explanation. A grotesque statue of the demon Asmodeus supporting a holy water stoup. Latin inscriptions that, when rearranged, form cryptic messages. Stations of the cross depicting details strangely at odds with tradition. A moon where there should be sun. A child hidden in the background, Magdalene painted with unusual prominence. It is as if the church itself had become a coded manuscript, a puzzle in plaster and paint. Saunière's renovations seemed obsessed with Magdalene. Her image appeared not as a penitent sinner, but as a central figure, radiant and dignified. Why would a provincial priest, under the oversight of a Catholic hierarchy, take such liberties? Unless he had found something that changed how he saw her. Local legend claims that Saunière stumbled upon hidden parchments concealed in a hollow pillar, documents that linked Rennes-le-Château directly to the Merovingians, and through them, to Christ himself. The story says he carried them to Paris, where they caught the attention of scholars, politicians, and perhaps even secret societies. He returned to Rennes not only wealthy, but watched. Of course, skeptics argue that Saunière's fortune came from selling indulgences, from corruption, from less romantic means. And yet, the physical evidence of his choices remains. The bizarre church decor, the sudden influx of wealth, the secrecy that cloaked his later years. If nothing else, Saunière acted like a man who knew something he could not speak aloud. And if you stand in the church today, the silence presses in. The demon's face leers from the shadows. The stations of the cross seem to whisper. The very stones feel heavy with meaning, as if they are holding back a secret waiting to crack open. Why here? Why Rennes-le-Château? Geography offers a clue. The region around Rennes is steeped in Cathar history. Nearby lies Montségur, where the last Cathar perfects were burned alive. Caves in the surrounding mountains are said to conceal relics smuggled away in the night. And legends abound of underground passages, hidden vaults, and treasures that were never found. If the Cathars or the Templars had guarded a bloodline, this would have been the place to hide it. And then there is the curious geometry. Researchers have long noted that the landscape around Rennes seems to align with sacred patterns, mountain peaks and village churches forming pentagrams and stars when mapped. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps deliberate. A cartographic code etched into the very land. Saunière died in 1917, taking his secret with him. On his deathbed, he supposedly refused absolution, whispering something that left his confessors shaken beyond words. The exact phrase was never recorded. Some say it was a confession. Others, a revelation too dangerous to be spoken aloud. But what he left behind was enough to ignite a century of speculation. Treasure hunters dug furiously around Rennes. Secret societies like the Priory of Sion claimed him as part of their lineage. Writers and researchers spun theories that still ripple through books and documentaries today. And yet, through all the speculation, one thread holds steady. Magdalene, the church dedicated to her. The statues, the paintings, the inscriptions, all circling back to her name, her story, her silence. Was Rennes-le-Château the site where Magdalene's descendants lived in secrecy? Was it the place where the guardians of the bloodline concealed their final proof? Or was it all an elaborate game, a priest's eccentricity mistaken for revelation? We cannot know for certain. But the mystery endures because it feels connected, because it binds together all the whispers we have followed so far. Merovingians, Cathars, Templars, Priory. All roads seem to lead back to this quiet village, where the bells toll over stone streets and the shadow of a forgotten priest lingers in the chapel air. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Not that the truth lies here, but that it lies so close to the surface. In a place so ordinary, it becomes invisible. As you leave Rennes behind, the question grows heavier. If Saunière stumbled upon proof of a bloodline, what else was hidden? What relics, what parchments, what genealogies still slumber in vaults across France, waiting for another accidental discovery? To answer that, we must turn to those who held not just symbols, but faith. Those who lived and died for a belief so dangerous it demanded fire. The Cathars. Section 8. Cathars and the Fire of Silence. Shift now from the quiet hills of Rennes-le-Château to the wind-swept fortresses of Languedoc, a land where olive groves cling to rocky slopes and ruined castles perch like broken crowns above the valleys. Here, in the 12th and 13th centuries, flourished a community unlike any other in Christendom, the Cathars. To the church, they were heretics. To their followers, they were the pure ones, the perfecti. To us, they may have been the last guardians of a secret too dangerous to survive. The Cathars believed in duality, a good, spiritual God who created the invisible world, and an evil, material force who created the prison of flesh. To them, the body was a trap. Salvation meant liberation from matter, not indulgence in it. Their leaders lived lives of stark simplicity, vegetarian, celibate, clothed in plain tunics. They rejected the pomp of bishops, the wealth of cathedrals, the authority of Rome. And for a time, their faith spread like wildfire through southern France. But alongside their theology ran a whisper. The Cathars revered Mary Magdalene with unusual intensity. In their liturgy, she appeared not as a fallen woman, but as a teacher, perhaps even a matriarch. Some traditions hint they believed in a secret lineage, an inheritance not of doctrine, but of blood. Imagine it. In the hills of Languedoc, far from Rome's gaze, a faith that not only rejected the Church's authority, but honored Magdalene as a vessel of continuity, perhaps even as the mother of Christ's descendants. Could this be why their presence was tolerated for so long, then suddenly erased with such ferocity? The violence began in 1209, when Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade. Unlike the wars against Muslims in the Holy Land, this crusade turned inward. Christian against Christian, neighbor against neighbor. Entire towns were slaughtered. At Béziers, when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics, the papal legate reportedly gave the infamous reply, "Kill them all." God will know his own 20,000 died in a single day. Why such savagery? Was heresy alone enough to justify genocide? Or was something more at stake, something so threatening that it had to be annihilated completely? The final act came at Montségur in 1244. Perched high on a rocky mountain, the Cathar fortress became the last sanctuary of the faith. After months of siege, more than 200 Cathars descended from the castle walls to face the flames. They walked into fire willingly, singing hymns as the smoke rose into the sky. But legend says that just before the fortress fell, a handful of Cathars slipped away under cover of night, carrying something with them. No chronicle records what it was. Treasure? A gospel? A genealogy? Or perhaps a relic that proved the survival of a bloodline? Whatever it was, the Church wanted it destroyed so badly that it unleashed fire across an entire culture. Look closely at the geography, and another layer emerges. The very regions where the Cathars thrived, Septimania, the Rosses, the foothills of the Pyrenees, overlap with the supposed refugees of Merovingian descendants. Coincidence or design? Could the Cathars have been the unwitting or deliberate custodians of that lineage? Even after the fires, fragments remained. Bees etched into hidden chapels, fonts shaped like chalices, local devotion to Magdalene that predated official veneration by centuries. The memory hummed in the ruins, in songs, in carvings no one could quite explain. To this day, pilgrims walk the Cathar Trail, following mountain paths carved by centuries of footsteps. They stop at caves said to shelter sacred bones. They pause at ruined abbeys where silence still hums like a second heartbeat. Few speak it aloud, but many believe the Cathars were not destroyed for heresy alone, but for guardianship. Guardianship of a truth that linked Magdalene to Merovingians and Merovingians to Christ. Ask yourself, what kind of knowledge demands that level of violence? What belief is so dangerous that it must be burned from memory, erased with blood and fire? Perhaps the Cathars carried a gospel not of words, but of lineage. Perhaps they believed that salvation was not only spiritual, but inherited. The divinity once walked in flesh, and that flesh left descendants. Rome could not allow that. So the Cathars died, their libraries burned, their songs silenced, their faith obliterated. But fire cannot consume everything. Memory seeps into stone. Ash fertilizes soil. Legends survive in the ruins of Montségur. When the wind moves just right, some say you can still hear the hymns of the dying, carried down the mountain like smoke that never dissipates. Their voices ask not for pity, but for remembrance. And remembrance is the one thing fire cannot destroy. The Cathars are gone, but the silence they left behind hums with meaning. And in that silence, a question persists. What secret did they carry down the cliffs on that final night? To answer, we must look not only to ruins, but to records. Records hidden, guarded, and locked away in the one archive on earth said to hold the most carefully controlled memory of all. The Vatican. Section 9. Archives and gaps. Imagine a door, massive, iron, older than memory itself. Behind it stretches not a treasure vault of gold, but something more dangerous. Shelves upon shelves of parchment and ink. Miles of memory. Miles of silence bound in leather. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, not because of conspiracy, but from the Latin secretum, meaning private. And yet, private hardly captures the weight of what lies within. Here, under climate control and constant watch, rest more than 50 miles of shelving, papal bulls, coronation decrees, letters between kings and popes, transcripts of trials. If the Merovingians truly threatened the balance of Christendom, if the bloodline of Christ was ever known, this is where the evidence would be. But the Vatican does not open all of its doors. Scholars may request access, but only to specific documents. They do not browse. They do not wander. They are guided, watched, permitted only glimpses, and whole swaths of history remain off limits. Sealed folders, missing registers, entire centuries of correspondence conspicuously absent. One such gap surrounds the very years when the last Merovingian king was overthrown. Letters from Pope Zachary, who sanctioned the deposition of Childeric III and the rise of Pepin the Short, are curiously missing. Why would records of such monumental importance simply vanish? Other anomalies appear in the reign of Pope Sylvester II, a mathematician rumored to have acquired forbidden knowledge. Whispers suggest he found something in early records, something unsettling enough that after his death, superstitions grew around his tomb. It was said to rattle whenever a pope of questionable virtue was enthroned. Coincidence? Or residue of a secret buried too deep? And then there is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books. Many of the works suppressed were not dangerous for their theology of God, but for their theology of Jesus. Texts that hinted he had married, that Magdalene was more than a disciple, that his legacy was not only spiritual, but biological. Were these books burned, or were they quietly collected and shelved in Rome's vaults? In modern times, even insiders have whispered about what remains locked away. The Jesuit priest and scholar Malachi Martin, before his death, spoke vaguely of knowledge too destabilizing to reveal. Evidence of a bloodline, preserved not to enlighten, but to protect the church from collapse. He never offered proof, but his insistence lingered like smoke from a flame unseen. Consider, too, the possibility of infiltration. The alleged priory of Sion was said to place operatives inside the church itself, scribes, monks, archivists, who recorded and preserved what others tried to erase. If that were true, then the Vatican Archive is not just a repository. It is a battlefield, a labyrinth where silence fights against silence. And what if the archive does contain a genealogy? a scroll carefully updated through the centuries, charting descent from Magdalene and Christ through Merovingian heirs to someone still alive today. The idea seems absurd, but pause and imagine the implications. A single document that could collapse dogma, shift the axis of faith from Rome to blood. A piece of parchment more powerful than any army. The Vatican, of course, denies everything. They insist the archive is not secret, merely private. They release selective documents, letters from Luther's excommunication, Galileo's trial records, as if to reassure the world of transparency. But for every document released, thousands remain sealed. And the gaps, the omissions, the silences, they speak louder than what is shown. Why guard what is supposedly harmless? Why deny access not by accident, but by design? Why does the Church fear what might be found? Perhaps because faith thrives on mystery, but collapses under evidence. Perhaps because to acknowledge even the possibility of a bloodline would unravel 2,000 years of carefully constructed authority. And so the archive remains, cold, silent, and alive, with the weight of what it does not reveal. Each locked cabinet, each missing register, a reminder that some silences are not passive. They are deliberate. Step back for a moment and breathe. The Merovingians were erased from chronicles. The Cathars burned in fire. The Templars vanished into shadows. And in Rome, the paper trail thins, precisely where their story intersects with power. That is not coincidence. That is design. If the archive does hold the truth, then perhaps the custodians of the bloodline no longer hide it in caves or castles. Perhaps they hide it in silence. Miles of silence, guarded by keys and permissions, waiting for someone willing to read what is missing rather than what is written. But memory is not confined to vaults. It bleeds into thrones, crowns, and coats of arms. And so, to trace the bloodline forward, we must leave the archive's shadows and step into glittering halls, modern monarchies whose pageantry may conceal ancient veins. Because if the line never died, then it still walks among us. Section 10. The Living Thrones. Shift your gaze now from the Vatican's sealed vaults to the polished halls of Europe's monarchies. Velvet thrones, golden crowns, portraits lined in oil and shadow. To most of the modern world, royalty has become ceremonial, relics of an age when kings held swords instead of signatures. But beneath the pageantry lies a question too unsettling to ask openly. Could any of these families still carry the blood of Christ? The official story says no. The Merovingian dynasty ended over 1,000 years ago. Their heirs were extinguished, their memory dissolved. But genealogists, both serious and speculative, trace threads that wind curiously forward, weaving through centuries of intermarriage until they resurface in unexpected places. Consider this. Nearly every European royal house today descends from Charlemagne. That much is fact. But Charlemagne's legitimacy rested on replacing the Merovingians. And if the Merovingians had merged quietly into noble families through daughters, then their blood may have flowed forward invisibly, carried not in names, but in wombs. The House of Habsburg, rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, married into countless lines that reach back to early Frankish nobility. The Bourbons of France, the Windsors of England, the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha line that intertwined German and British crowns. All of them share tangled roots in the very soil where Merovingian kings once reigned. Most official genealogies emphasize male descent, tracing lineage through fathers. But blood does not vanish when surnames change. It flows quietly through daughters, hidden in plain sight, passed from mother to child in unbroken chains that do not need heraldry to endure. By that measure, the so-called extinction of the Merovingians may have been nothing more than a shift in names. And here symbols return once more, like fingerprints on polished crowns, bees woven into tapestries, fleur-de-lis stitched into coronation robes, stars and roses etched into seals and crests. Some heraldic devices claimed by modern royals echo strangely with Merovingian iconography, as though the memory of a forbidden bloodline still lingers beneath layers of pageantry. Take Napoleon Bonaparte. When he crowned himself emperor in 1804, he could have chosen the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon dynasty he had overthrown. Instead, he chose golden bees, the emblem of the Merovingians. Was this coincidence? Or was Napoleon deliberately reaching back beyond Carolingian and Bourbon claims to the oldest line of kings in France, asserting himself not as usurper, but as heir? Or consider Elizabeth II, whose genealogy, through Alfred the Great, through Germanic houses, through countless marriages, intersects with lines that reach back into the Frankish kingdoms. Historians scoff at the idea of sacred blood. But in a world where every noble is connected to every other through centuries of alliances, the possibility is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Skeptics argue that without DNA, such claims are unprovable. Royal family trees are notoriously embellished, their records filled with gaps, assumptions, and convenient fictions. Wars, plagues, and revolutions shattered lines as often as they preserved them. And yet, the whispers persist because they feel plausible, because power has always found ways to preserve itself, not only through conquest, but through continuity. Beyond crowned heads, there are families with no thrones, but ancient claims. Noble houses in rural France, in Switzerland, in northern Italy, who keep dusty genealogies in locked drawers. Old Latin notations scrawled in the margins of family Bibles. Seals pressed into wax, handed down through generations. These families do not seek power. They seek preservation, as if waiting. If the bloodline exists, what would it mean today? Would it confer authority? Would it shake the church to its foundations? Or would it simply be a curiosity, proof that history is stranger than myth, but powerless to change our world? Perhaps that is why the idea has survived so long. Not because it can be proved, but because it can never be disproved. The ambiguity itself gives it power. A monarch crowned with sacred blood is no longer just a figurehead. A common family quietly carrying that inheritance becomes more than anonymous. In both cases, the bloodline is disruptive, a story that threatens the structures built on silence. And so the symbols persist. Bees in embroidery, roses in stone, a child's name echoing one from the 7th century. They are not proofs, but they are reminders. Reminders that history is never as tidy as textbooks would have us believe. Think of it this way. Kings may abdicate, crowns may fall, empires may crumble. But blood does not abdicate. It flows on, indifferent to politics, carrying memory in veins that never asked to be holy. Somewhere, perhaps even now, someone walks through a garden unaware, or perhaps very aware, of the inheritance carried in their cells. A bloodline older than Charlemagne, older than crowns, older even than the Vatican's silence. And if that bloodline is real, then it was never extinguished. It was merely hidden, waiting. But to understand how such a legacy could survive into modern times, we must look not only at monarchs, but at secret societies. Organizations that may have preserved fragments of the story through ritual and allegory, long after kings and priests tried to erase it. And none are more entangled in this mystery than the Freemasons. Section 11. The Masonic Veil. Step now out of palaces and into quieter chambers. Paneled walls of oak, dim light of candles, the scent of smoke curling through the air. Men gather in aprons embroidered with symbols, their voices low, their gestures precise. Outsiders see only pageantry, ritual without meaning. But to those inside, every symbol is deliberate. Every gesture encodes memory. This is the world of Freemasonry, and here too the trail of the Merovingians may linger. At first glance, the Masons are a fraternity of builders, inheritors of guild traditions, champions of reason and brotherhood. Their myth traces back to the Temple of Solomon, where master builders carved stone not only for walls, but for meaning. And it is within this myth, beneath the allegory, that some believe fragments of a deeper truth are hidden. Consider the beehive, a central Masonic emblem. In their lore, it represents industry, cooperation, harmony of the many serving the whole. But for those who have followed the Merovingian thread, the bee means something else entirely. It was the emblem buried with Childeric I, the golden insect that symbolized resurrection, immortality, divine kingship. The same bee Napoleon revived for his coronation. When it appears in Masonic halls, engraved between compasses and pillars, is it simply metaphor or continuity? Then there are the twin pillars, Boaz and Jachin, said to guard the entrance of Solomon's temple. In Masonic ritual, they symbolize strength and establishment. Yet to those reading between the lines, they also suggest guardianship, gateways not only to a temple of stone, but to a story guarded in silence. What story? Perhaps the one we have been tracing all along. A bloodline, a lineage too dangerous to speak aloud. Masonic initiation involves death and rebirth, the symbolic slaying of the candidate, followed by a resurrection. Officially, this is a moral lesson, the triumph of virtue over mortality. But viewed through the lens of the bloodline theory, it takes on a different resonance. What if the ritual encodes not just morality, but memory? The survival of a divine lineage, cut down by betrayal, yet reborn in secrecy. Some degrees of Freemasonry lean even closer to the heart of the mystery. The Rose Croix, for instance, tells of a persecuted figure martyred for his knowledge, whose truth survives despite suppression. In one version, the initiate emerges not under the cross of Rome, but under a symbol of the rose, an ancient emblem tied to secrecy, blood, and rebirth. The parallels with Magdalene, often depicted with roses and with the Grail as womb, are hard to ignore. The Catholic Church has long condemned Freemasonry, branding it heretical and dangerous. Officially, this is because the Masons place reason above dogma. But could there be another reason? Fear that their symbols and rituals preserve echoes of a story Rome tried to erase? If the bloodline survived, hidden in allegory, then every lodge, every ritual, every carving of a beehive or rose might be a quiet act of remembrance. And then there is Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by the Sinclair family in the 15th century. Patrons of the Templars, entangled in Masonic lore. Its walls are carved with impossible images. Plants from the Americas before Columbus, angels playing bagpipes, endless patterns of roses and stars. Beneath its sealed vaults, ground-penetrating radar has hinted at hidden chambers never excavated. Legend says documents lie there still, scrolls tracing a lineage not of kings, but of Christ. Skeptics dismiss this as myth layered on myth. They argue that Masonic symbols are metaphors for morality, not genealogies. The Rosslyn's carvings are eccentric art, not codes. And yet, denial itself sometimes rings hollow, as though too rehearsed. Think of it this way. If the bloodline were real, would it be preserved in open chronicles, where kings and bishops could destroy it? Or would it be hidden in allegory, preserved by builders, disguised as morality plays, whispered from initiate to initiate, until the memory itself became ritual? The phrase, "the lost word," appears often in Masonic lore. Officially, it means the ineffable name of God, forgotten and sought. But what if the lost word is not a word at all, but a name, a family name, a line, a genealogy? What if the Masonic search is not for language, but for lineage? Consider the geometry of Washington, D.C., a city designed by Masons. Its streets form pentagrams, stars, owls. Obelisks rise like ancient markers. Bees and roses appear carved into official buildings where they should not belong. Coincidence? Or unconscious echoes of a legacy carried across the Atlantic? Albert Pike, one of Freemasonry's most influential thinkers, wrote of kings not crowned by right, but by sacrifice, men who carried the divine within them and were hunted for it. He never mentions Merovingians. He never mentions Magdalene. But read the line again, and you feel the shadow of a story buried deeper than allegory. What emerges is not proof, but persistence. The beehive, the rose, the lost word. These symbols recur like fingerprints. If the bloodline survived, then perhaps it does not walk openly through palaces or cathedrals. Perhaps it walks through lodges, encoded in ritual, preserved not as doctrine, but as performance. And if so, then every Mason's oath is not just a vow of fraternity, but of guardianship. A guardianship not of treasure, but of blood. The Church calls it heresy. Historians call it fantasy. But symbols do not lie. They endure, waiting for those with eyes to see. And yet, Freemasonry is not the only place where the bloodline may have been preserved or corrupted. In the 20th century, it caught the attention of a darker order, one that twisted myth into ideology and symbols into weapons. The Nazis, Section 12, Shadows of the Reich. The thread of the Merovingians, of Magdalene, of hidden bloodlines, might seem like the stuff of medieval whispers, destined to fade with time. But in the 20th century, it resurfaced in the most chilling of places, the machinery of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle were not content with politics alone. They craved myth. They sought symbols older than nations, truths that could be twisted into ideology. For them, legitimacy was not only military or economic, it was mystical. And at the center of this hunger stood Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS, who dreamed of transforming it into a modern knightly order, a new Templar Guard for a corrupted vision. The SS motto was, "My honor is called loyalty," but its chambers and rituals hinted at something deeper. Himmler redesigned Wewelsburg Castle into the spiritual center of his order. Its floors bore the black sun, a symbol of cycles, rebirth, and hidden power. Rooms were named for legendary knights. One chamber, the so-called Grail Room, was constructed with perfect acoustics, as though it awaited ritual designed to awaken something beyond stone. Why this obsession? Because the Nazis believed that myth could shape reality. And among the myths they pursued most fervently was the Holy Grail, not as a cup, but as a legacy, a bloodline. The SS established the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Institute, a research body dedicated to uncovering proof of Aryan supremacy. Its members scoured Europe, the Middle East, even Tibet, searching for artifacts, manuscripts, and sacred sites. One destination was Rennes-le-Château, the very village where Saunier had uncovered his mysterious wealth. The Nazis combed its hills and crypts, convinced that the Grail, or evidence of the bloodline, lay hidden there. To them, the Merovingians were not merely kings. They were prototypes of their ideology, long-haired, semi-devised, rulers with sacred inheritance. Himmler speculated that the assassination of Dagobert II had been a conspiracy to bury not only a dynasty, but a truth, that sacred kingship flowed through European blood. Twisted into Nazi thinking, the Merovingians became Aryan paragons, proof that divinity belonged not to all humanity, but to one race. And then there was Magdalene. Some Nazi researchers argued that she had fled to France not as exile, but as vessel, carrying the blood of Christ into Europe. If that bloodline survived, then in their perverse logic, it sanctified European descent as uniquely holy. In this distortion, the sacred was weaponized, turned into a justification for supremacy. They studied Cathar legends too, especially the story that a treasure had been smuggled from Montségur before its fall. Some believed that treasure was the Grail. Others believed it was a genealogy, a chart that proved descent from Christ. And in both cases, the Nazis wanted it. Did they find anything? The historical record is murky. We know that the Ahnenerbe seized manuscripts, some of which vanished after the war. We know they excavated castles and cathedrals in southern France. And we know that Allied forces confiscated hundreds of crates of Nazi archives, many of which remain classified or missing. Within those crates, whispers say, were documents referencing the Child of the Rose and the Covenant of the Bee. Vague phrases, but hauntingly familiar to anyone tracing Merovingian lore. Consider the timing. In the 1930s and 40s, scholars who pursued this mystery often vanished, some during the war, others under circumstances never explained. Coincidence? Or had they stumbled too close to a secret still guarded, even in the age of tanks and bombs? Here we must be clear. The Nazis did not seek truth. They sought power. They twisted sacred symbols into weapons, turned myths of unity into justifications for genocide. Their obsession with the Grail was not about understanding Christ's humanity. It was about co-opting it, bending it into the service of hate. And yet, within their corrupted quest, fragments of the old mystery resurface. The fact that such men would chase bees, fleur-de-lis, Cathar legends, and the Magdalene relics tells us something. These whispers were not inventions of the 20th century. They had endured so long, carried with such persistence, that even in the darkest age, they were still deemed powerful. Powerful enough to pursue across continents, powerful enough to die for, or kill for. It is a sobering reminder. Truth, even half-remembered, can be twisted. Sacred memory can be weaponized. What was once inheritance can become ideology. And so, after the war, the trail fractured again. Some documents disappeared into Allied archives, others into private collections, still others, perhaps, into silence. But the thread did not break. It simply shifted. For while Europe burned, another possibility stirred across the sea. If the bloodline had survived centuries of suppression in France, if it had escaped the flames of Montségur and the shadows of the Vatican, perhaps it had crossed the Atlantic itself. And if it did, it may have found sanctuary in the stone walls of a chapel in Scotland and the rugged coast of Nova Scotia, carried by a family whose name lingers in the margins of our story. The Sinclairs. Section 13. Across the sea. The story of the Merovingians may feel anchored in Europe, cathedrals, castles, abbeys, and vaults. But whispers suggest the legacy did not remain bound to the old world. Legends claim it crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus, carried by a family deeply entangled in Templar, Masonic, and Bloodline lore, the Sinclairs of Scotland. The Sinclair family, sometimes written as Saint Clair, was no ordinary noble house. They were patrons of the Templars, protectors of exiled knights, and guardians of a legacy written not only in chronicles, but in stone. Their ancestral seat, Rosslyn Chapel, constructed in the 15th century, is a cipher in architecture. Its walls carved with symbols so dense, so eclectic, that entire libraries have been written trying to decode them. Walk inside Rosslyn, and you see things that defy explanation. Carvings of maize and aloe, plants native to the Americas, etched decades before Columbus's voyage. Pillars twined with roses and vines that seem to echo Cathar and Rosicrucian motifs. Angels playing bagpipes. And everywhere, subtle references to Magdalene, veiled women, chalices, roses blooming in stone. Beneath the chapel, ground-penetrating radar has revealed sealed chambers, long rumored to contain scrolls smuggled out of Jerusalem, relics of the Templars, perhaps even genealogies tracing the Holy Bloodline. No excavation has ever been officially permitted. Silence remains the guardian. But the Sinclair's story stretches beyond Scotland. One of their ancestors, Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, is said to have voyaged west in 1398, nearly a century before Columbus, reaching the shores of Nova Scotia. Skeptics dismiss the tale as legend, but the evidence lingers in strange places. Carvings, oral traditions, even a faint effigy known as the Westford Knight in Massachusetts, which some claim bears the Sinclair crest. Why would the Sinclairs have made such a voyage? Not for conquest, not for empire, but for concealment. If they were indeed custodians of relics or documents tied to the bloodline, what safer refuge than a land beyond Rome's reach, beyond Europe's wars, a place where memory could hide in forests and stone? This brings us to Oak Island, off the coast of Nova Scotia. For over 2 centuries, treasure hunters have dug furiously into its depths, finding tunnels, booby traps, strange wooden platforms, and inscriptions that hint at something buried deliberately, protected with cunning. Some believe it is pirate gold, others Templar treasure. But to those who follow the bloodline thread, Oak Island may conceal something more than coins. Parchments, genealogies, relics, the very proof of a sacred lineage, carried across the sea and hidden beneath layers of earth and salt water. No one has ever unearthed definitive treasure. But the very persistence of the search, the way so many of the clues echo Merovingian and Templar symbolism, makes the island feel less like a hoard and more like a vault. A vault designed not to be opened, but to endure. The Sinclairs themselves remained entwined with secrecy. They appear again in Masonic lore, their family names surfacing in documents and rituals. Their chapel at Rosslyn is often described as a Bible in stone, but others call it something else. A genealogy in stone, a record not of scripture, but of blood. Imagine this possibility, that the Priory of Sion, the Templars, or their inheritors, handed fragments of their guardianship to families like the Sinclairs. That these families carried their burden across oceans, into forests, into stone. That Rosslyn Chapel and Oak Island are not disconnected curiosities, but 2 ends of the same thread. A thread that ties Jerusalem to Gaul, Gaul to Scotland, Scotland to America. Even the founding of the United States has been pulled into this narrative. Many of its architects, Washington, Franklin, Hancock, were Masons, steeped in symbols and rituals that echo bloodline lore. The geometry of Washington, D.C., its obelisks, pentagrams, and owls, may be more than civic design. It may be continuity, a way of carrying memory forward under new banners. Of course, skepticism looms. Historians scoff at claims of pre-Columbian voyages, at the notion that a Scottish earl sailed to Nova Scotia with secret relics. They argue Oak Island is nothing more than an elaborate natural sinkhole, Rosslyn Chapel nothing more than artistic flourish. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps. But pause here. If the bloodline did survive, if it had to be hidden across centuries, across continents, how else would it endure? Not in chronicles easily burned, not in tombs easily raided, but in places where stone and earth could speak only to those who knew the language. Rosslyn, Oak Island, Washington. 3 names, 3 sites, 3 echoes. None of them proofs, all of them symbols. And perhaps that is the point. The bloodline may never have been meant to rule again, but simply to endure, encoded in stone, buried in earth, whispered across seas. As we leave the Sinclairs and cross back into the present, the trail sharpens again, not in thrones or chapels, but in parchment, in scattered maps and documents, some real, some forged, all pointing toward the same question. Where does the bloodline hide now? And with that, we step into the world of lost manuscripts, coded maps, and parchment fragments. The cartography of a secret, Section 14. The parchments and the maps. Step away now from chapels and castles, from vaults of stone, and imagine instead the fragile crinkle of parchment. A scroll rolled tight, sealed in wax, its edges browned by centuries of air. To most, it would look meaningless. Faded ink, cryptic symbols, words half lost in archaic Latin. But to those who know the language of secrecy, it is not nonsense. It is a map, not always of land, but of legacy. Across Europe, fragments of such documents have surfaced in archives, libraries, and private collections. Some are proven forgeries, others authentic but incomplete. And yet, when laid side by side, they whisper of a pattern, a thread that connects Merovingian kings, Magdalene legends, and Templar guardianship into a single lattice. Take the Lobinot document, one of the so-called dossier secrets deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in the 1960s. Officially dismissed as a modern fabrication, it nonetheless overlays the region of Rennes-le-Château with odd lines and initials. Points connect chapels, dolmens, grottos, forming geometric shapes, pentagrams, stars, vesica piscis. Coincidence? Or deliberate cartography, a way of encoding not treasure, but lineage? Other parchments speak cryptically of the Tomb of Kings, not the biblical site in Jerusalem, but an alleged hidden burial place in southern France, where Dagobert II's body was reinterred after his assassination. Local folklore insists that within this tomb lies not only the king's remains, but scrolls detailing descent from him, a genealogy too dangerous to leave in plain sight. Then there is the Magdalene Trail, an informal pilgrimage route stretching from Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer to the caves of Sainte-Baume. Along this path stand chapels dedicated to Magdalene centuries before Rome formally venerated her. Frescoes and inscriptions along the route show a veiled woman, sometimes with a child, sometimes with a rose or chalice. Pilgrims still walk this trail, often unaware that each chapel may be less a place of worship than a waypoint in a larger map, a map of memory. Whispers also tell of the shepherd's document, discovered in a private collection near Arles. Written in a mix of Latin and Occitan, it speaks of a line of fire, passed from the Mount to the Rose. To the untrained eye, it is poetry. To initiates, it may describe the transfer of guardianship. From Montségur, last stronghold of the Cathars, to Rosslyn, the Sinclair Chapel rich in rose imagery. Fire, Mount Rose, symbols not of theology, but of continuity. Skeptics, of course, argue that every parchment linked to the Merovingian mystery collapses under scrutiny. Too convenient, too theatrical, too perfect a fit for the myth. And yet, forgery itself tells a story. Why fabricate unless there was already a rumor, a hunger, an echo demanding shape? Forgeries flourish only where memory refuses to die. Even Oak Island, across the Atlantic, carries its own parchment legend. Fragments allegedly unearthed in flooded tunnels, bearing inscriptions no one has fully translated. Some call it nonsense. Others insist the symbols resemble early Occitan ciphers, tying Nova Scotia back to Languedoc and the Magdalene Trail. What is striking is not any single document, but the repetition. Roses, bees, stars with 7 points, maps aligning landscapes with constellations. Over and over, the same motifs return, as though a code has been written not once, but endlessly across centuries. Layered so thickly that even when half is forged, half is erased, the shape still shines through. Think of it this way. A parchment may lie, a forger may deceive, but a pattern of centuries is harder to dismiss. Too many scrolls, too many maps, too many geometric alignments point to the same places, the same names, the same possibility. One particularly curious case is the copper etching of Montségur, discovered in the 1920s. It depicts 5 stars forming a pentagram, each aligned with a local landmark: chapels, caves, ruins. When plotted on a modern map, the pattern remains intact. Local legend calls it the seal of the queen. But which queen? A Magdalene as vessel? Or a descendant who bore both sacred and royal blood? These fragments, scattered like shards of a broken mirror, refuse to vanish. Families guard them in drawers. Archives mislabel them. Treasure hunters chase them into ruin. But taken together, they suggest the possibility of a truth hidden not in one place, but in pieces. Fragments meant never to form a whole unless the right eyes gather them. Perhaps that is the final trick of the Merovingian code. It does not reveal itself in a single scroll or tomb. It survives in dispersion, a network of symbols scattered across the land in parchment, designed to resist destruction. Burn one document, the pattern re-emerges in stone. Destroy a chapel, the geometry persists in geography. Suppress a legend, it surfaces in ritual, and so the question remains: what if the final proof of the bloodline is not a document at all? What if it is a place, a single tomb hidden by maps, encrypted by parchment, containing relics that would silence centuries of debate? No one has found it. No one may ever. But the parchments persist, drawing seekers ever deeper into the labyrinth. Some return empty-handed. Others never return at all. And yet, the trail endures. Because truth, if it exists, is never lost. It is only hidden. And in the darkest years of the 20th century, that trail was not merely followed, it was exploited. The parchments and maps fell into the hands of men who twisted them into nightmares, transforming memory into ideology. We have seen their shadows already. But now, let us descend fully into them, into the Reich's obsession with relics, blood, and Grail. No longer whispers. Now, fire. Close your eyes and replace the musty air of crypts with the sterile hum of servers. Imagine rows of hard drives blinking like votive candles, each one storing fragments of the past. Dust no longer clings to parchment. Memory is scanned, digitized, encoded. Welcome to the 21st century, the new cathedral of archives, where the search for the Merovingian bloodline no longer belongs to monks or masons, but to algorithms. For centuries, access to knowledge was restricted. To read the right scroll, you needed papal permission, political favor, or a key to some family's locked drawer. But today, more and more documents are becoming public. Ecclesiastical registers, noble genealogies, even manuscripts once hidden in the Vatican itself. They appear online in vast digital libraries, waiting to be searched. And search is no longer human alone. Artificial intelligence sifts through millions of words without fatigue, spotting patterns we might miss. Names repeating across centuries, marriages that link forgotten dynasties, symbols tucked into the margins of scanned images. What once took lifetimes of scholarship can now be done in weeks. Already, hints emerge. Researchers training AI on medieval baptismal records discovered a recurring name, Melena de Sangre. It appeared in France, Spain, and even England, always tied to noble families, always just beyond official recognition. The name itself is suspicious. Melena, evoking Magdalene, Sangre fusing blood and sacred. Was it a code used by priests to mask a lineage in plain sight? Or coincidence multiplied by centuries? No one knows. The researcher who first published it vanished quietly from online forums, their work archived by strangers before it could be erased. Other anomalies surface in the so-called dossier secrets. Long dismissed as mid-20th century forgeries, they have been reanalyzed with stylometric software. While parts match the hands of modern fabricators, one fragment does not. Its rhythm, syntax, and vocabulary align with late Renaissance Latinists, suggesting it might predate the supposed hoax. That fragment mentions the anointed blood in exile, a phrase out of time, yet precisely in line with the whispers we have traced. And then there are the digital breadcrumbs, hidden in plain sight. Steganographic codes embedded in images, metadata anomalies in cathedral scans, zero-width spaces in digitized manuscripts spelling out initials when decoded. To most, these are glitches. To some, they are signals. If the guardians of the bloodline still exist, perhaps they no longer hide scrolls in tombs. Perhaps they hide messages in the very files we scroll past every day. Skeptics call this paranoia, our tendency to see patterns where none exist. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps the Merovingian code is nothing more than coincidence woven into obsession. But pause. Symbols endure. They outlast fire, censorship, dogma. Why should they not also outlast time in digital form? The Vatican, too, has entered this new frontier. Select parts of its apostolic archive are now online, but anomalies remain. Collections mislabeled. Entire sets of Carolingian documents marked under review. Keywords scrubbed from indices without explanation. To some, this is bureaucracy. To others, it looks like the same silence, updated, digitized, and uploaded. Here's the unsettling thought. If AI can connect threads once lost, then secrecy itself must evolve. Guardianship may no longer mean burying treasure in hills, but burying truth in algorithms, making it invisible, not by fire, but by absence in search results. So where does this leave us? Perhaps the Grail was never meant to be an object or even a bloodline. Perhaps it is a signal, a pattern stretching from bees carved in tombs to codes hidden in servers, always whispering, there is more. Look closer. And maybe that is the true inheritance. Not crowns, not scrolls, but wonder. The refusal to stop asking. Because the bloodline, real or imagined, has already changed history. It shaped crusades, inspired wars, fueled secret societies, even warped into ideology under the shadow of the Reich. And now, it has entered the digital age, where anyone with a screen and curiosity can join the search. So ask yourself, what if the final grail is not hidden in Rosslyn or Rennes, not in Montségur or Rome, but in you, in your hunger to connect threads, to remember what power tried to erase? History has always thrived on silence, but memory, true memory, lives in the act of reaching. And so the Merovingian line, whether flesh or fable, endures. Not because it was preserved perfectly, but because it was never forgotten completely. Somewhere in the noise of data, in the hum of servers, in the glow of a digitized manuscript, the code still waits. Not for knights, not for kings, for seekers, for you. Close your eyes. The candle has burned down, the parchment has crumbled, the server lights blink on, and still, the line remains.